What I will do today is show you, it's not so difficult, that heavy truck decarbonization strategy may succeed if there is sufficient coordination, so I'm very confident on that. Maritime decarbonization, I don't see it happen. Of course, you can always save a little bit here and there, but the technology is not there. Okay, let me start with decarbonizing heavy trucks. Decarbonizing, so you have trucks of all kinds of, I'm not going to distinguish all the different types of trucks, but the idea is that the new trucks, certainly the new trucks by 2040 should be, let's say, 90% decarbonized. And as most of the trucks that are used intensively, these trucks are in the end only used for 5 to 8 years, and then they put so that they will make small trips. So the most important thing is for the new trucks indeed to be decarbonized. Major question is what technology to use. And here I used a lot of Swedish technology input, okay. First question is usually first I have to stay right here. Yes. Clearly, the best option is to directly use electricity. Some people say, yeah, we should move to hydrogen, but whenever you talk with engineers, I think immediately they will tell you, if you have electricity, if you have renewable electricity, and renewable electricity or nuclear energy, whatever, it's clear that the best way to use it is to use it directly in an electric engine. Not to start to use it to produce other fuels. And the other fuels would then be hydrogen. Once you have hydrogen, of course, you can use it in a fuel cell. But if you do this operation, you will have to invest in making hydrogen. You will have to invest in the fuel cell, and in both elements of your supply chain, you will lose a lot of energy. So it will be much less efficient. And of course, some people say you can also go from renewable energy to liquid. If you like to drive a Porsche, probably there's an exception on electrification of cars. You can drive a Porsche, traditional Porsche, with traditional fuel, and the fuel has to be an e-fuel, has to be made using hydrogen and carbon. Using hydrogen and carbon, you can make any traditional fuel, and so you can drive your, of course. That's not a solution we advocate. Now, whenever you start to use electricity directly, you can do it in different ways. You can use it directly using big batteries. Now, big batteries, I'm talking about, for a big truck, is 5 tons of batteries. Usually you need almost 500 kilo of batteries if you have a car that goes a certain distance. Of course, now you will need at least 5 tons of batteries, okay? That's one solution. The other solution is to go for overhead lines. It's like we do. You see it here in Lausanne. You have these trams connected to overhead lines. And that's a solution which has certainly also interesting properties. What I will call that bot trucks or catenary trucks. Now, questions are here. If you go for what I call e-roads, these overhead lines, the government will have to intervene. Okay, the question is, do it now or later? Should it be coordinated? And we will see that it mainly makes sense in very dense countries. With dense, I mean with a lot of truck traffic on the motorways. This means Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of France. I'm not so good in France, but maybe part of Switzerland, but not in Sweden. Although this research has been paid by the Swedish government, the result was that it doesn't make a lot of sense for Sweden. Okay, so the main difference between battery-only trucks, so the very, very big battery, okay, is one advantage. It's called vehicle-to-grid options. Vehicle-to-grid means that whenever the truck is not used and is still not completely empty, you can use it to help the grid whenever you have a local scarcity, okay? very important thing, it will also come for cars. It's not yet fully developed or not yet fully implemented, but it will come. Now, recent developments is this CATL, very fast. They promise very fast charging. So you would only need 5 or 10 minutes to fill up your car. It could also come for, obviously, for trucks. But also, then you also need a very large intake of power. So it will be costly for your power system. You have to be careful. So there are different elements in that. Overhead line trucks, smaller batteries. That's the main advantage. It will be a truck that will have less weight. Okay, so it can carry itself more weight. The fact that it need less batteries, it will be much cheaper. Think about what is the cost of a truck. A fully electric truck will cost you in the future, let's say the next 10 years, 300,000 euros. A diesel truck, 100,000. So it's a big difference. I don't see a lot of companies immediately invest 300,000 euros in electric trucks. Say, okay, it's electric, you should select me because I'm an electric truck. Okay, not so sure. What we'll do is, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in the cost of the battery. In the first period, we will have, first period is 2025, 2035. There's actually no uncertainty. In the second period, we'll just introduce a lot of uncertainty on the side. So we'll only reveal the price of a battery in 2035. Okay. And then in the first period, you will have competition between diesel, battery-only trucks, and overland trucks. In the second period, it will mainly be the competition between the two electric trucks. The model that is used is very simple. This is not an operational research conference, so we use only very simple models. And let me try to explain the story using this graph. What matters a lot for a choice of a truck is what type of trips will you do? And in trucking, I'm going to explain it this way because then you can drive per day maximum 9 hours. So regulations, you cannot drive for longer than 9 hours because the drivers maybe will lose attention, will become more dangerous. And you have to make a stop after 4.5 hours. Now, that will determine the size of the battery. Imagine, so we're going to assume that you will choose a battery that can at least make a short trip. So this means that this will be the minimum size of the battery you will need, okay? Then you make a small stop. You have to drink a coffee. In the meantime, you can load your battery, okay? Here it's not fully loaded because it's not just the most performant technology. And then you can continue again. If you say, yeah, the batteries are 2 and I don't have to make so many long trips, I will opt for a battery that is not too large. It will be cheaper. It will be a 200,000 truck rather than a 300,000. I have to recharge again, and then I can continue and make my trip for 9 hours. So 9 hours, close to 400 kilometers per day. So this will be the minimum battery size. Depending on whether the truck does on average a lot of small trips or a lot of long trips, that will determine the battery size a truck owner will choose. Okay? So the mechanism is rather simple. We have a distribution of trucks. Some of them do a lot of small trips, a lot of days with small trips, put it this way. Others just have a lot of days with long trips. They will go for a larger battery. That's a system we are using. We have perfectly competitive truck companies. They minimize the cost of an average daily trip, okay, by selecting an optimal truck type. Can be a battery-only truck or a truck that is connected to overhead lines. And they, if you go for a battery truck, you have to choose the optimal battery size Just comparing whether it's worthwhile to make a stop or not will depend on how many days you make long trips. Okay. This will be the outcome. This will be the choice of the truck companies. There will be a demand for different types of trucks, demand for different types of batteries, and also their charging behavior. The final step is that the government will invest in overhead lines or not. So a very simple model with actually 2 or 3 steps. Okay, the first period, we figure out that these overhead lines are rather, I would say, marginal. So what is the story here? You have a lot of lines, but here actually the green line is the diesel. And the average cost per day will depend on your share of long trips. Share of long trips is exogenous, okay? You will see that the overhead lines, installing overhead lines is interesting, whether you have vehicle to grid or not. So it's interesting. And it's actually, because the government is investing, it only makes sense if this difference between, in this case, the diesel and the overhead lines, if this margin, this cost saving is sufficient to justify an investment by the government, okay? Because the government is installing this system. It only makes sense if it decreases sufficiently the cost of the trucks. Okay, you can do, then we go into the second period. So one of the main variables is what can we expect in terms of cost of batteries. Here we assumed that it can be low, can be half, can be 75, which is pretty low. Can also be a little bit higher, 125. And also the electric road can become a little bit cheaper, but not to the same extent as the batteries. And then again, you have the same type of graph. The same type of graph, of course, now we have a low and high, etc., etc. But in the end, e-roads are clearly a winner. So even in the case we have low battery cost, it may be interesting to have these overhead lines. Okay. Now, of course, that's a very simple story. You can make it much more complicated. You can say there's a lot of uncertainties. You do some kind of Monte Carlo. Here in this case, it didn't make a lot of difference. Vehicle to grid, I say it's important, but it's not crucial. And one of the most important points, we did the analysis for kind of the major roads in Europe, okay, what are called the 10T network, for those who know the road system. What you can say, of course, there's part of this network is very low density, part of the network is very high density. So it's clear, rather than to have an equipment on all the roads, what you do is I concentrate my investments on the very dense roads, okay? And I will not do it on the roads with low density. So in Sweden has very low density. Germany has very high density for different reasons. Because whenever you have a larger country, there's much more trade within a country. Because you have more trade opportunities within a country than if you're a large country. We will find more easily a partner. Okay. So the result was that a country like Sweden will not invest. It's not interesting for them. Germany and other countries will, with lots of motorway, will do it. And then the next step, we try to find whether it makes sense for those countries to cooperate and whether, for instance, Germany could subsidize Sweden to develop the network, because also for Germany it's interesting to have their trucks with low batteries being used in Sweden. Okay, but okay, we looked at that. Unfortunately, it's not interesting. And so the solution is clearly that electric trucks are there to come, at least under our assumptions. E-roads are the most interesting option for countries with more dense freight motorways. And of course, we need EU harmonization. I was in France, I don't know, beginning of this year, where I discovered that the French and the Swedes and the Germans all have different ideas about electric motorways. So of course, things will not go forward if you cannot agree on the technology. And unfortunately, that is not yet the case. Let me now move to shipping. So I would say we have a nice story for trucks. For shipping, it's a much more difficult story. There's a lot of ambition within the EU. Anyway, I will also mainly deal with intercontinental shipping. What the EU says, okay, maritime is important. We're gonna consider it as important, and we're gonna oblige the maritime sector to use ETS permits. Who is non-familiar with ETS permits? Okay, ETS permits is a very simple system. You have actually what we did in Europe is we look at the total of emissions of the industry sector, of the electricity sector, and of aviation within Europe. This total of emissions, okay, has to go down to almost zero in 2050. This means that every year you have a cap on total emissions. Now, if you say you have to need a permit, and you need to have a permit in order to emit CO2, this permit has a certain cost. What is the cost? Between 60 and 100 euro per ton of CO2. So this means actually obliging the shipping sector to buy permits, to buy permits, or to pay kind of a tax of 60 to 100 euro per ton of CO2 associated to the fuel they use. Okay. Now they also want an obligation to reduce average intensity. So it would be sufficient to have just go to zero by just putting a limit on total emissions. And here I think I like the graph because it illustrates the ambition. I do not necessarily agree with the ambition, but it's very nicely presented that you go from, let's say, 31% in 2050 to minus 80%. You have almost a green ship. Okay, the question is, does it work? Can it work? Does it make sense? And they also want to impose it for all international shipping. If the Chinese come in with containers, the question will be, you come from China, half of your trip you will have to pay emission permits. If it comes from America, it's also the same story. You will have to pay emission permits. I don't immediately see how it works or whether it will work, but okay. So again, a model we will use is very, very simple. It's a model where we have shippers. The shippers try to minimize the cost of shipping. They say, I got some taxes, I got some obligations. I will try to comply with these obligations. And the cost of greener ships are convex in the percentage of emission reduction. Then the shippers are hired by traders, and the traders, because we have competitive shipping, the traders pay the competitive shipping price, okay? Then the final step, the government may agree, the government here may be EU, maybe China, maybe another country, another big country. They have to agree whether they join forces and say, we agree to limit emissions for our bilateral trade relations. We can agree with China, we do something together. That's the model, so it works in 3 steps, actually very simple, almost 2 steps. This is a kind of negative message here. What we try to do is put together many different types of technologies and say, can we eliminate all emissions here, up to 100%. What are these technologies? Are they around? We have this cost curve. With present cost of electricity, we have this solid line. If you have very, very cheap renewable electricity, maybe you can go to this dotted line. But overall, making sure that you have no emissions in the shipping sector means it will normally cost you something like 500 euro per ton. Okay, it's not impossible. But then you have these e-fuels, e-methanol, okay? You try to produce e-fuels, reconstituting fuel by just using hydrogen and carbon, put it together, and then you have a clean fuel. if the hydrogen is produced using renewable energy. Okay. So this will play a role. Then you can think about different types of cooperation. You can say, I can have full cooperation in the world. I dream that the whole world is cooperating, is good-willing. Okay, maybe it will ultimately be there. And then set the price of CO2 at 120 euro per ton. You will reduce emissions something like 11%. So even if the price of CO2 is already high, and there will be a reduction of trade. You make shipping more expensive, of course there will be less trade. And of course it's not obvious that this will, if you have less trade, you have to really think about some countries, if they produce more at home, maybe it also puts more CO2 emissions in their own production. So it's not guaranteed. Now, there is something like International Maritime Organization, there's agreements, they're making agreements about reducing the carbon content. So we see that in the press, we see all these agreements. And I'd say I'm not a pessimistic, but I think I'm more like realistic in this sense. It's unlikely to happen. First of all, okay, many things can happen with green fuels, but they're very costly. I used to also tell stories about aviation. It's the same story. Aviation is even more difficult because making a good aviation fuel is slightly more difficult than a good shipping fuel. Global cooperation is difficult because the revealed preference for climate policy is very different in the world. This is a graph that gives you an idea about what is the current prices or prices of permits or taxes implemented for CO2 in the whole world. And you will see that, of course, Europe is active there. Canada does something, okay. And there are some countries that do something, but many countries don't do a lot, have small values. There's an input into the model. In the next step, we model a negotiation process between different groups of countries and try to see what will be the outcome. Now, in the negotiation process, think about a ship going from Europe to China. It's a global public good, so every ton of CO2 emitted on this journey will harm Europe, will harm China. So in the end, we have to look if both are cooperating, and China thinks about 20 euro per ton. Europe is thinking about 60 euro per ton. So you could say, we could think about 80 euro per ton if both have equal power in the negotiation. That's the idea. It's very simple. It's a public good. You are two partners to produce. Okay? What we find is actually rather low values. In the end, okay. We don't see a lot of things happening. So we cannot expect with the current technologies that we will reduce emissions very strongly. Of course, the EU can put shipping under ETS, and I'm certainly not against it. It will mean that certainly for trips inside of Europe or coastal shipping, it still makes sense. There will be an effort. It could be that this ETS is used for other good purposes to reduce emissions, so that as such is a good thing. But I don't believe that Europe putting, let's say, half of all the emissions to the US or to China will be taxed, that will be accepted by the other big countries. So on that side, okay. I'm afraid it will not work. Let me try to conclude on EU freight. So it's a very hopeful story for trucks. For trucks, mainly a truck is used inside the EU. Okay, we have some Russia, whatever, but mainly EU. Technology is there. I don't think it's really a model split question. I don't see real fare increasing a lot. Once you have the electricity option, or renewable electricity option, or electricity option for trucks, I think, at least when it comes to CO2, an electric truck and rail, there's no difference. You can say, yeah, rail is cheaper. Yeah, it's not cheaper most of the time. Okay, it has some other advantage, but then you have to focus on the other advantage. And by the way, even if a truck per ton uses more electricity than a train, it does not really matter, okay? Because everything is under the same cap. Okay, that's thinking true. For maritime, it's a different story. It's EU story, but also to a large extent international story. The technology is not yet there, and many, so people think about sailing ships. You know, sailing ships. Sailing ships existed, they have been replaced by steamships, etc. Maybe a sail can help a little bit, but technology is not yet there. And the result, if you implement that, it will mainly be a reduction in international trade volume, will also be costly. And you say it's no guarantee that that in the end will also reduce total emissions. This is my story, simple story. Thank you very much for listening.
Quick questions. The first one, crazy idea, but to have ITS which depend on the type of the good, because you may say, okay, that's the business as usual, maybe we cannot handle that, my second question. And on necessity good, you have some kind of tax. On luxury good and Apple you bring from the other part of the world and so on, you have a higher tax. Does that make any sense? And my second question is about electricity. It's not ideal in the sense that you have to produce electricity. How do you so if you don't want nuclear and you want everything electric, how are you going to do that? And I am not speaking about resource, lithium, cobalt, copper, blah, blah, blah. So in your thinking, do you incorporate all these requirements, yes or no?
Let me first answer. The first question is easy. As an economist, I say, okay, if you want to address an environmental problem, it makes sense to have the same tax or the same permit for whatever the good. And if you want to redistribute income, you do it in a much more efficient ways to do that, at least if you know the income. Okay, if you don't know the incomes, then it gets a little bit more difficult. But here in our Western societies, we have more or less what everybody is earning. And that's the way to go. When it comes to electricity production, I believe a lot in renewable energy. Maybe, okay, we'll have to wait a little bit before renewable energy is sufficiently strong. I don't rule out nuclear, so you can continue you do a renewable of the present nuclear power stations for the next 20 years. Gives you a lot of leverage. And if we have good pricing of electricity over the day and over the seasons, there's a lot of things we can do to cover the variable production of renewables. That would be my answer. And I've seen, so I have colleagues working in engineering, and I follow them closely. They say, okay, we can do it. And has been demonstrated also in the case of Europe, maybe not in all countries. For that, what is necessary is good cooperation, good interconnection between different countries. When the sun shines in Germany, it could be that it rains in Spain. Okay, you see, these type of stories are important. Otherwise, you cannot rely on renewable energy. And of course, we also hope that the Norwegians help us with hydro, etc. So there's a lot of cooperation necessary. But if you want to do it, I think it can be done at a reasonable cost.
A question about substitution between trucks and maritime. In the case of transportation between, for example, China and Europe, you have the Silk Road, and if you have electric trucks, do you consider that it is an alternative to the maritime road? And we can say, well, if you say yes, probably it is yes also for between China and Africa and Europe. Then we can say, well, it is almost done if the US want to isolate from the rest of economy. Okay, so it is almost a joke. So sorry for Robin for Canada. And then my second question is about there is submarine, military submarine with nuclear power. Do you think that there is some hope to extend this technology to freight, maritime freight?
Good question. I did not consider the second question as one of the technologies. It was not, did not enter the matrix. At the first question, I think, let's say Antwerp used to transport goods to China using rail. So the rail connection has been reinstalled, has been used. Now, of course, they go through Russia. There's a problem for the moment. It's interrupted, but if there is kind of some peace or some kind of, you can keep it functioning, Western Europe can be connected to China, and rail is considered as one of the options. Whether it's, and that would be beneficial for the climate, I think. Now, for the other continents, I don't know very well. Whether it works to Africa, I think we'll have to wait for a lot of investments for this to happen. But okay, can be an option. Thank you.
It is a very basic question about vocabulary. You were talking about decarbonization of freight.
Yes.
Right? But actually, it's more like electrification of freight that you were talking about.
Yes.
And I was wondering, I mean, there was one statistic that struck me at the beginning. You told that heavily used trucks were lasting only 5 to 8 years, if I got that.
Let's say, these heavily used trucks, they do more than 100,000 kilometers per year.
So every 5 to 8 years, they are discarded. So, I mean, to produce a truck, you need a lot of...
What they do is then they will put into...
recycling,
They will make small trips.
So basically, my question was very simple. If you take a life cycle analysis, how much you decarbonize actual freight compared to the existing regime using diesel? Factor 3, factor 2, I mean...
Well, I think it will be, I would say you eliminate all fuel associated to used in the trucks. And then it's a matter of discussion. If the batteries are produced inside of Europe, they're also part of this global cap that goes down. And so in that sense, I do not worry too much about the total CO2 footprint. Of course, you can say, the primary materials are coming from Africa or whatever. Okay, that's something else. But if the battery is produced in Europe, it's to some extent part of the same system. And so it's really decarbonization. So I'm more like believing, of course, if you say this ETS will not last, things like that, that's a different story, of course, but we work in the present institution. Thank you.